Since the beginning of this century, I have written hundreds of well-researched essays in my native language, Dutch. In response to the seizure of power in Syria by a group that literally dedicated itself to bringing the end of times closer, IS or ISIS, I wrote my first book in English, available as e-book, titled IS, the Kurds and the Caliphate, and subtitled Turkey from Sick Occupant to Paranoid Neighbor. The English book that I recently wrote is also available in print. It's called 4949 and its subtitle is The Emperor's Old Rags. In anticipation of publication of 4949, I have set up a website, olddutchpainter.works, and there I published a number of essays in English. Some of those Dutch essays I wrote before 2023 are worth reworking into text or videos in the English language like this one. So most of the research of this video I did in 2011. I published a text based on that research on the now mostly defunct website Islamophobia, with a question mark, yes. Making this slightly updated English version was a surrealist experience, really. In a way I felt absolutely obliged to add a comparison between appeaser Neville Chamberlain and the likes of him on the one hand, and Keith Starmer and that King Charles III on the other. That 2011 essay was about a young German student in Oxford who later naturalized to British nationality. This other German, Adolph, in 1934 won a debate with Winston Churchill in Oxford and became secretary of the student club in Oxford, a German. His name, Schlepegrell, is a bit like that of the Führer, who would have had the name Schickel Gruber if his father had not changed his name from that of his unmarried mother to that of his progenitor. But this other Adolf was definitely not some rank and file member of the party of Hitler, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Adolf Schlepegrell studied in Oxford thanks to Cecil Rhodes. Yes, that was the very wealthy and very powerful namesake of the country Rhodesia, which is now called Zimbabwe. Oxford University is one of the oldest and most persistent strongholds of that narrative of do away with all Western achievements. In that respect, it's not strange that also a guy called Tariq Ramadan once was a celebrated employee there. This Mr. Ramadan became famous by advocating the suspending of stoning adulterers and cutting off hands and feet until Sharia had brought some progress in other areas. Those Fabians for a long time enjoyed great popularity in Oxford too. That group that poisoned the young mind of a person became really famous later, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. A club of communist students in Oxford still existed in the year 2011. After the horrors of the First World War, pacifism flourished in Britain and among students in Oxford more particularly. This led, for example, to that infamous motion in which a large majority of the students vowed never to fight for God and country. At the time, Adolf Hitler was rising to absolute power in Germany. Now in 1934, that's why it's in the title, Chuchill had been persuaded to give an introduction to the Oxford students. The year before this, Mr. Schlepegrell had already gained some fame with his statement that it was the fault of the whole world, not just Germany, that Hitler was Chancellor. You can find more about it in The History of the University of Oxford, Volume 7, Part 2, on page 406. Now, the direct confrontation between Schlepegrell and Churchill didn't last very long and was in keeping with the Oxford tradition of debate for the sake of debate. After Schlepegrell had called for the immediate withdrawal of French soldiers from the Saar area to make a kind gesture towards Mr. Hitler. A furious Churchill made a mistake by harping on German guilt for starting the World War, the First World War, of course. Triumphantly, the Schlepegrell threw the question to him, does Mr. Churchill believe that the German people, the men and the women who live in Germany today, are responsible for the war? Please answer yes or no. And Churchill said yes. And the Schlepegrell had only to bow and walk away to receive great applause. And shortly after this victory, he became, as a German, secretary of the Oxford Union of Students. I read more about this in the work of one Edward N. Luttwak, Strategy and Politics, Collected Essays, that was published in 1980. In his continuation of his story, this Luttwak condemned Churchill's position because in his Churchill's assessment of Hitler, he based himself on the reality regarding the rearmament rather than on propaganda. Does it sound familiar? In the light of world history, it's unreal to read about the victory of Schlepegrell over Churchill. It's even more unreal in the light of the future of Schlepegrell's own life. After returning to Germany, despite the fact that he had a very good press there for this victory over Churchill, he got into some trouble because one of his grandmother was of Jewish descent. So he fled back to England, became a British citizen and worked for the British intelligence service in the fight against Hitler. I cite the magnificent biography of Churchill, the trilogy by William Manchester, Part 2, aptly titled Alone, page 70. This is still in the long prologue titled A Fever Over England. Ironically, when Schlepegrell returned to Germany, where he had become a newspaper hero, the authorities found that one of his grandmothers had been Jewish, and this disqualified him from taking a bar examination. Eventually, he became a naturalized British citizen and served as a political intelligence officer during World War II. Later in that 1934 discussion, after the Germans, Schlepegrell, Churchill also declared, British rearmament is essential for us to be safe in our island home. And the audience, to his surprise and consternation, burst into laughter. He repeated this phrase, and the laughter grew. Yes, the title of that part of the magnificent trilogy was Alone, for a reason. Turning a blind eye for German Nazism was still absolutely dominant in 1934, comparable with what we see today in formerly Great Britain with regards to Islam and jihadism. This brings me back to that comparison between Keir Starmer and Charles III on the one hand, with the person who symbolizes the term appeasement, Neville Chamberlain. On 30 September 1938, Chamberlain returned from a conference with Mr. Hitler in Munich after the Third Reich already made quite some progress in conquering some smaller countries. And on this occasion of his meeting, Hitler was prepared to sign a piece of paper for Mr. Chamberlain. Chamberlain returned to Great Britain by plane. Coming out of the plane, he held that piece of paper above his head with the signature of Adolf Hitler. I think the behavior of King Charles III and this Keir Starmer is far worse than that behavior in 1938 of Neville Chamberlain.